You're back on the Zero Hour. I am, as always, your host, Richard RJ Eskow. My next guest has known me for an extremely long time. My brother, John Eskow, is a writer and musician and former, I guess you would say, back in the college days, political activist, may still be. And he knew and worked with Abbie Hoffman back in the day. Now, many of you know that there is an Aaron Sorkin movie about the trial of the Chicago Seven. Abbie Hoffman is played by Sacha Baron Cohen. That's not a movie I want to see, but it has stirred up a great deal of interest in Abbie and what he really stood for. And I thought, who better to talk about it than my own brother, John? So first of all, John Eskow, thank you for coming on the Zero Hour.
Thank you for getting my name right. Good pronunciation.
Yeah, Eskow, is that? Yeah, the escrow. Okay. And audience, John will probably refer to me as Rick, which is how my family and old friends address me. I don't know where this RJ thing came from, but it's a long story. So, John, I'll start with a quick anecdote. When I was, I'm going to say 14 or 15, so 68 or 69, you were home for Thanksgiving or something from college, and the phone rang. And at this point, Abbie was, I think it's fair to say, one of the most famous people in the country, certainly.
Absolutely. In the world, perhaps.
Yeah, probably. With that unmistakable voice of his. And the phone rang. So in the kitchen, we were all eating. I picked it up, and the operator said, "Will you accept a collect call from Anna Kaufman?" And I said, "Who?" And this unmistakable voice said, "No, operator, Abbie Hoffman." So Abbie was calling our home collect to, so of course I accepted the charges on Dad's behalf, but to speak with you. So that's the only time I ever had contact with Abbie, but fleeting as it was. But if you don't mind, just tell us about how you met Abbie and how you got to know him.
Well, by the way, I remember that phone call well, too, because our father, who was at that point the president of a community college and a respected figure in the community, who was also in the kitchen. And I remember him looking at our mother with an expression of baffled incredulity and saying, "It's Abbie Hoffman for John." And it was as if the operator had said, "I have Mao Zedong calling for John." It was completely out of his realm of experience. And I should point out, I was only 17 years old at the time. That was shortly after I had met Abbie. I met Abbie, to make a long story short, as a result of working as a student advisor on a college that was then being planned, the State University of New York at Old Westbury. And a bunch of New York radicals came out to spiel us about their point of view. And among them was a guy named Marty Carey. Marty Carey was an activist and an artist who was Abbie's best friend. So as a result of that friendship, Abbie and I became very friendly, even though I was only 17 and he was 30, which at that point is, of course, quite an age difference. In fact, he used to refer to me as the littlest yippie, which was kind of playing off a Disney movie title, The Littlest Cowboy or whatever. And he also used to call me the kid. How's the kid? How's the kid? I was kind of the Robin to his revolutionary Batman, if you will. He saw something in me that appealed to him. And shortly after we met, we jointly planned a demonstration at the State University of Stony Brook, where I had gone originally. And he involved me in that as if I was a grown man. So I quickly became a fellow yippie, and we maintained a friendship off and on until his death. So I got to see the whole span of him. When I first met him, he had not yet become a hippie. In fact, he had short hair and he was virulently anti-hippie because he had just come north after a couple of years down south in Mississippi, organizing for SNCC. He worked very closely with Stokely Carmichael. And the first real conversation we had, I remember very vividly, he was almost in tears as he told me the story of being banished from SNCC by Stokely Carmichael during a long night in which they shared a lot of joints and a lot of wine. And Stokely Carmichael told him, look, you know, you got to go. We Black people have to do this for ourselves now. We can't, I love you, man, but you know, this has to be an all Black movement from here on in. This is become a Black nationalist movement. And Abbie did everything he could to try to talk him out of it. And in retrospect, I think that was a tactical mistake by Stokely Carmichael, but that's just me. I remember very clearly that at that point, there was a radio commercial that the Jefferson Airplane did for Levi's jeans. And to Abbie, that summed up everything that was wrong with what he called hippie capitalism. He said, don't they know that their brothers and sisters are on strike at the Levi plant in North Carolina? You know, that enraged him. And he swore that he would never have anything to do with hippie capitalism and that LSD was like a diversion from revolutionary fervor. I didn't see him for about 2 months. The next time I saw him, his hair was in a huge afro. He was tripping on acid. He had completely gone the other way. And he had seen the political organizing possibilities in youth culture as it existed then, and he had embraced it fully, as we all know now in retrospect.
You know, what keeps him such a fascinating character for me, personality, is that he had, you know, people know him for the theatricality and the drama. He was incredibly funny and charismatic, and people remember that. But he was also, I've been going back and reading some of his writing, he was also really a brilliant organizer. He really understood what it meant to organize, to treat everybody as an equal, 17-year-old kid, whoever else you might meet. He understood ultimately the value of culture in organizing. He even says here at one point, I'll read this to you, Jack. He says, wearing your hair long might have seemed frivolous to some of the more straight people on the left in the 1960s, and this is something I remember well, but I tell you, that was a full-time commitment because you were ostracized from your community. You were kicked out of classes. You were picked up by the cops. You could get beaten up. You could get your head shaved. So
hell yeah.
Many of which we all experienced, right?
Yes.
So this sense that it was a commitment to step away from the system was part of his organizing genius, as was some of the other work he did. He really understood this stuff inside and out.
Yes, and in fact, that was at the core of his organizing brilliance. I remember him saying, when they tell us that, you know, your hair is too long and you smell bad and everything, you never defend yourselves. You always stay on the offense. You say, yeah, I'm going to grow my hair down to my ass. I'm never going to take a bath. It's that you just ruthlessly move forward. He had the sense of a true revolutionary that way. You may recall a story I've told you a number of times in that regard about an experience that was utterly terrifying that I had with him once on the street with a bunch of Black guys on the corner. You remember that story?
Yeah, sure.
At that point, the Lower East Side was kind of a divided turf between the remnants of the Polish community who still lived there and some poor Black and Puerto Rican people, and what was seen by a lot of people as an invading mob of hippies. And often these forces came into violent contact with each other. Abbie and I were walking down the street, and there were 3 Black guys on the corner. And as we passed, one of them said to Abbie, hey, man, when are you going to take a bath? And Abbie looked at him and said, whenever I feel like it, white boy. And for a moment, my world went completely black in the sense of dark. And there was a moment of shock and amazement on their faces. And then a moment later, they were slapping Abbie 5, and we were smoking weed together, and we were all brothers, and they came to a yippie meeting. That was that they respected in him that very refusal to cower that we're talking about here. And whether that took the form of risking a physical beating, many of which he had in Mississippi, and certainly which he had in Chicago. Parenthetically, Norman Mailer said that Abbie was the most physically brave man he had ever known. He truly didn't fear violence. And that gave what we could loosely call the revolution a kind of dignity that otherwise would have gotten lost in floral print, psychedelic, unicorn fantasies of hippiedom. He was hardcore.
He was hardcore, and as you know, and again, we're talking with my brother, John Eskow, writer and musician, and old comrade of Abbie Hoffman's, about Abbie Hoffman. John, what I was thinking was, as you were speaking, was I interviewed Chris Hedges once, and I asked him, he had met so many revolutionaries in his war correspondent days, and the guy who stood down the tanks in Tiananmen Square, and the woman who was an environmental organizer in Honduras who was murdered, Berta Caceres, and so on. And I asked him why these people always seemed so fearless. It seems so contrary to our wiring, right? To be fearless. And he kind of paused for a second and he said, because they've chosen. And
because they what? Sorry?
Have chosen.
Mm-hmm.
They've decided that, this is their life.
Mm-hmm.
That this is what they're in for. And I was wondering, is that what Abbie also reflected? Was it that? Was it the fact that he was kind of a street hoodlum in Worcester, Mass? Was it so he was very physical growing up, a fighter? Was it all of the above? What do you think?
Well, Abbie was steeped in, for better and for worse, I would say, in the heritage of American machismo that I also was raised in. So whether that meant willingness to engage in fistfights, or the belief that athletic prowess was important and could be used to dominate other males. He found a way to put those, we could call ethics in a way, which are very ambiguous in their effects on men and in our lives as men, but he found a way to put that to great use. On the issue of physical fear, I will say that while the word fearless is absolutely correct. I remember one time when we were on an LSD trip together and he went on a prolonged jag about the inevitability of his being killed. And he visualized it as being shoved into an alley by cops and having his head blown off. And his thought was, and this coincided with Huey Newton's theory of revolutionary suicide, was that we all have to die, and Abbie's chosen way of dying was to die for the cause.
Kind of makes it tragic the way he did die.
Yes, the ultimate tragedy.
In his 50s, yeah. And there's so many ways to go with this, but one of the things I think you quoted it to me or to somebody who did an oral history on Abbie, that, this to me was the clarity of his thinking was, we're not going to get, everybody watches the 7:00 news, true then, not true now, but 7 to 7:30. We're not going to get 7:03, that's Lyndon Johnson's time. We're not going to get 7:15, that's the Senate's time. But they got to do that little quirky story at 7:27 to close out the show. That's what we're going to get. So we did the dollar bills dropping on Wall Street, which to this day, that was 1969, one of my favorite political/media actions ever. And because they couldn't help themselves, they were just singles and fives maybe, and they dove for them.
Yeah.
It was just such a great revelation. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was not working off the cuff all the time, was he?
No, he was unique in that he was a fusion of both a media analyst and an activist. That what you just quoted which is an anecdote that I tell in Larry Sloman's oral biography of Abbie, has always stuck with me over the years, because that's a kind of insight into the use of media that, oddly enough, the only person who ever reminded me of Abbie's talent for that was many years later was Michael Deaver, if you remember him, in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
I often think that if the Democrats or Republicans had somebody right now with that depth of understanding of how to use the media, their candidate would win in a walk. It's almost laughably amateurish how badly they use the media now, except you could say probably for Trump.
I think that's unquestionably true. Now we have, John Eskow, the concept of earned media, right? That you earn by being newsworthy as opposed to paid media. And Trump in 2016 was the master of earned media. He just got $2 billion, according to one estimate, of news attention by knowing how to capture the news cycle. Of course, though, I've many times I've wished that Abbie were still around to analyze. It's such a different media landscape now, right?
Yeah, well, Abbie's, there's a third kind of media attention beyond the earned and the other one. What was the other one you mentioned?
Paid.
The paid.
Yeah.
And the third one would be media by virtue of spectacle. And that was Abbie's genius, whether it was exorcising the Pentagon. He was not solely responsible for that idea. There were a lot of people involved with conjuring up the exorcism of the Pentagon. Ed Sanders of the Thugs and Paul Krasner and Abbie and our friend Martin Carey were all involved in dreaming that stunt up. But I mean, how brilliant. Exorcising the Pentagon, such an incredibly right on and perfectly apt metaphor put into spectacle on a level that the Romans would have envied. Where is anybody doing that now? It would still work.
To me, the brilliant extra twist on that Pentagon story was when he claimed, I don't know if it's true or not, that they asked for a permit to levitate the Pentagon as part of this exorcism, asked for a permit to levitate it 100 feet, but he insisted that the judge would only allow them to levitate it 10 feet.
Right.
So it didn't interfere with air traffic.
He later claimed that it actually did go up by a couple of inches, by the way.
I'm not buying it.
Well, there are a lot of things that Abbie said that you couldn't buy, believe me.
This is here. Right.
But you could rent them.
So these are, he was asked, John Eskow, in late 80s, I guess, or sometime in the 80s, do you believe that the Weather Underground movement of 20 years ago had a positive effect? And so do you believe that a similar group could affect a change in today's present police state? He goes on to say, look, if you were in El Salvador when they killed Archbishop Romero, if you were an organizer and believed in peace and justice, you'd have organized a demonstration. They would have killed you. You would have gone into the mountains, been a guerrilla. But he says, these aren't the alternatives I see facing you today. You have to have the courage to challenge power, to do so publicly, both physically and in the streets and in your mind. But you also have to learn to work within the system so as to institutionalize the changes that you want. So he was always thinking about this. And, I read that and I thought, well, does that mean he'd, have done what Tom Hayden did and supported Obama, or what does it exactly mean? But I don't think so. And I want your thoughts on this. While he was underground, and then toward the end of his life, when he came back, he did a lot of work on local issues, cleaning up the St. Lawrence Seaway, nuclear power, local pollution, as well as very focused issues like the CIA. Death squads and so on. So do you think that's what he meant by institutionalizing your changes, going after institutional targets that you can move?
Well, he knew how to adapt. And let me just backtrack for a second to tell a story that I hope illustrates this. As many younger people don't know, for a period of about 2 or 3 years, Abbie was the #1 most wanted fugitive on the FBI's fugitive list. He had been arrested for a cocaine deal, brokering a large-scale cocaine deal, which he did. And I mean, I could digress as to why that happened out of a kind of ongoing need for adrenaline rushes, but that's another subject. But he had been arrested, he had skipped bail, and he was a fugitive, and they were looking for him everywhere, and they were very serious about it. And in the midst of this, I was at that point, I think 22 years old. I got a phone call in my little apartment on the Upper West Side, and I heard a very familiar voice with a very familiar Worcester accent say, "Hi, it's me, don't say my name." And I immediately recognized who it was. And he said, "This is Barry, okay? It's Barry. You're going to call me Barry." I said, "Okay, Barry, what's up?" And he asked me to come down to the Hotel Lucerne on 77th Street between Broadway and Amsterdam. And from there, we embarked on an adventure, which was that he asked me to come with him on the run up to the St. Lawrence Seaway to a house that was owned by his girlfriend, Joanna Lawrenson, and help him write his autobiography, which was eventually published as soon to be a major motion picture, which was a title that he stole from me. Not the first time or the first thing he ever stole from me. Maybe we'll get into that. But so my girlfriend, later wife, Allison, and I went up to the St. Lawrence Seaway with him and Johanna and stayed there for about 6 weeks, working on his autobiography every day. He was at that point, to return to your point, working to save the St. Lawrence Seaway from pollution. He had renamed himself Barry Freed. He claimed that he had had plastic surgery and that I wouldn't possibly recognize him. I immediately recognized him. He looked almost exactly the same, except that he had cut a bald spot into the top of his head. And of course, he was so identifiable by his voice. All America knew that nasal Worcester accent at that point. And at one point, we were hanging out at the house with a bunch of the local river rats that he had befriended. And a report came on the NBC Evening News that we were all watching about the ongoing hunt for Abbie Hoffman, fugitive Abbie Hoffman. No one knows where he is. And it was an out-of-body moment for me to be sitting in the room with Abbie, being the only other person who knew that he was the guy sitting next to me. I wondered what was going to happen. And Abbie immediately said, I bet he's like down in Mexico drinking tequila and running around with the horse. He didn't miss a beat. I would love to have had that kind of what the French call sang-froid for myself, but I don't think I ever did. Yeah. And while he was there, he got so active in saving the St. Lawrence River that he got a commendation from Senator Daniel Moynihan and posed proudly for a picture with Daniel Moynihan, who never knew that he was with America's most wanted fugitive.
Yeah, that is sang-froid. That is a cool-headedness that few of us possess. The flip side to that, you alluded to it a second ago, John, was, he was kind of not above some rascalry, some thievery, some hustler, characteristics, right?
So, yeah, well, Abbie was, he would certainly now be diagnosed as severely manic depressive, which is what gave his oratory such wings, but also sent him crashing to the ground. And his behavior was very erratic. At one point, while he was a fugitive, before he called me, I can't remember if it was before or after, but it was during this general time period. I was staying with his best friend, Martin Carey, in Woodstock, and we got a call from the folk singer Eric Anderson, who had been taking care of Abbie. And Abbie was having a psychotic breakdown, and Eric Anderson asked us to come to this nearby motel and pick him up. and take custody of him, basically. And we went over to this motel, and Abbie was running around and screaming in front of the motel, throwing a buck knife into the mud and screaming. Last week I was in Hollywood sleeping with Candace Bergen, and now I'm here. And like, he wasn't making any sense. And we finally corralled him into the room. And at this point, I was a poor young poet. And when we got ready to leave his motel room, I noticed that my wallet was empty. All my money was gone. And I told this to our mutual friend, Marty. And Marty went over to Abbie and said, give John his $125 back. And Abbie said, I didn't take his money. And Marty said, I saw you holding his wallet. And Abbie said, I was just rearranging the bills. And he never gave me the $125 back. But later, when it came time to divvy up the payment for his payment from Random House for his autobiography, he gave me a quarter of it, which was much more than I would have been happy with a, much smaller payment. But so he had his own concept of ad hoc justice, I guess.
Honor among thieves or whatever. You live outside the law, you must be honest and all that stuff.
Right.
So do you, first of all, I just wanted to tell you another quick story because I thought you'd appreciate it and get your thoughts on it. David Graeber, the anthropologist and one of the guy who came up with the 99% as a phrase, as a political framing, who died recently. He was a favored guest on this show. Brilliant guy. One of the architects of Occupy. In one of his articles, he wrote that the 60s reshaped American military policy, and that the reason why we didn't, quote unquote, win in Iraq and didn't even care about winning in Iraq is because ever since the 1970s, U.S. military policy has had as its primary priority making sure that it's not conducted in a way that creates mass demonstrations at home. So no draft, no major, no buildup of troops to 300,000 people or whatever, as we had back then. They'd rather avoid demonstrations at home than win a war. And so they've lost a lot of them. And David concludes that paragraph by saying, in a sense, it's as if the ghost of Abbie Hoffman has defeated the U.S. military.
Wow.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's quite a statement. It makes me think of what constitutes a leader. Why does out of 10,000 equally bright, equally committed people, why does one guy become this charismatic, magical figurehead for a movement who can coalesce all these rumblings and angers and crystallize them into something? I actually the other day was looking up the Latin derivation of charisma. It's actually a Greek derivation. And in its original meaning, it didn't have anything to do with the kind of personal charm meaning that it now has, and which Abbie also had in abundance. It meant literally ordained by the gods to have power.
Huh, that's
interesting. And in that way, you could even say in a strange sense that Donald Trump has charisma. Clearly, objectively, he achieved it. Abbie had charisma on both those levels, the personal and the ordained by the gods sense. It was as if he had just stepped into a suit of clothes that was tailored for him, by Savile Row in London. It just fit him perfectly. And I don't know why that happens or why it can't be made to happen. I've often wondered if there was a youth culture figure like that, would he or she, it would probably be a woman now, probably be a woman of color. Maybe, I'm certainly to some degree, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez possesses that kind of seemingly born to have power kind of charisma. But nobody has it, and perhaps nobody ever can, because of our the way our culture is so widely spread out now.
Yeah.
But boy, he had it. And it appeals still. I mean, Abbie appears in an Oliver Stone movie. He appears in a Steve Earle song. The power of what he did was so intense that it continues to reverberate to your friend David Graebener 50 years later. It's wild.
Yeah, and a psychiatrist, I think her name was Elizabeth Redfield, if I remember correctly, wrote a book about bipolar 1 disorder, which was Abbie's condition, I assume, called "Touched by Fire." That was the name of the book, about famous people with. Maybe you've read it, but and I just wonder whether the coda to Abbie's life was, that moment, that sort of intersection, that lining up of the planets, that causes you to be touched by fire. It shifts, it changes, the moon goes behind a cloud. I wonder if that contributed in some way to the sort of implosion that led to his death, because I would sure love to have him around now.
Yeah, well, as the 60s devolved into the 70s, a whole lot of radicals obviously had to figure out what their second act in life was going to be. Yeah. So on the one hand, you had Jerry Rubin transforming himself into the archetypal yuppie and going 180 degrees in the other direction and becoming unashamedly and brazenly capitalistic and self-centered and materialistic. You had Eldridge Cleaver doing a similar thing. People were scrambling to reinvent themselves. Abbie had no other, he had no second act. That was it. The only second act that he really had was to be a criminal. And he tried that, and he wasn't that good at it. And he got caught the first time he really tried to broker a large-scale dope deal and went to jail and became a fugitive. And so when the scenery shifted, he didn't know how to shift with it. Certainly not the worst failing a person could have. A lot of us got temporarily or permanently caught up in that warp between the exhilaration of the 60s. And that's the one thing about Abbie that above everything, I would probably want to communicate to young people. When you were with Abbie, life was electric. Every second was infused with meaning. It was fun. He communicated a sense that revolution was a joyous way to express yourself. It wasn't a duty. It wasn't an onerous charge. It was what Abraham Maslow used to call a peak experience.
Yeah.
And that was that extra dollop of joy was what made it so infectious.
Well, John, if you don't mind, John Eskow, I think I'm going to give Abbie the last word right now on that very point that you just made. He gave a talk at a college campus in the 80s, and he concluded it this way. He said, sure, we were young, we were arrogant, we were ridiculous. There were excesses. We were brash. We were foolish. We had factional fights, but we were right.
Good enough. Well said.
All right, man. John Eskow, writer, musician, thanks so much for your recollections of Abbie Hoffman, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Rick. Take care.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you are listening to The Zero Hour.